And that, so hypocalcemia, what do you think it would do then?
It would lower the threshold.
When,
Well, bringing it closer to threshold.
yeah, bring it
Yeah.
closer to threshold.
Yeah.
Yeah, so right outcome, but different method of getting there. So it would depolarize it, leaving you closer to threshold.
We're talking about the second one, right?
That was hypocalcemia.
Hypocalcemia. It would make it depolarize.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
there's less calcium
Going.
outside to
Oh,
just
okay.
keep the gates.
So it'd become more positive.
Correct. Okay, is
Makes
everyone
sense.
all right with that, or do we need to
Yes.
go through some of those?
Makes sense.
So
yeah.
what about if there's more leak channels on the outside of the cell?
Give me one
Sorry.
second, I'll hit that right after hyper and
Just
hypocalcemia.
jumping like that.
Sorry.
So hyper and hypocalcemia.
Hypercalcemia?
So hypercalcemia,
So that's
that's what increased what?
Outside. So that would
Increased
depolarize
what
it.
outside?
Isn't potassium?
Potassium.
Okay. I was going
Okay.
on a limb
I
there.
was like, people are just going above outside. I'm like, okay, what? Okay, so a lot of potassium. Neutral charge being put out here, but more potassium.
So the hyper and the hypo are all outside of the cell. Is that correct?
Yeah. Sorry.
Because it's emia.
Emia
In the blood.
Yeah, in the blood. Duh.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay. So if I have a lot of potassium out here, what's going to happen? Why?
Because there's more potassium inside, and so the potassium wants to leave, but if there's already more potassium outside, it lowers the desire for the potassium to
Because
leave
it
the
wants to
cell.
go in.
So it decreases potassium's concentration
Yeah.
gradient, right? It's not going to flow out as fast if there's a lot out there as well. So it's going to stay in here. More positive inside the cell, depolarizes the cell. Okay. And then hypocalcemia.
It was.
Hyperpolarize. Everyone okay on why?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Everyone good
Mhm.
on all those things?
So hypercalcemia and has the same end result as hypocalcemia.
No.
That they both.
No, they would have different results. So
Hyper-
hypercalcemia.
No, hypercalcemia
Oh, okay. So hypercalcemia.
and hypocalcemia. Right.
Okay. So hypercalcemia has the same end result as hypocalcemia.
That they both.
Correct.
Okay.
I didn't know that one.
Because they both have bring the.
Yeah. They would both hyperpolarize the cell.
Okay.
Si bueno. Sorry, I had to.
I had to think through it.
Which is
Hyper-
totally okay.
Okay.
It's okay to think through it because memorizing it is absolutely pointless and doesn't help you in any way, shape, or form. What will help you is if you can draw a cell on your test, ask for a piece of scratch paper, draw a cell, draw where concentrations of things are, and then think it through. Because the process or the physiology of how things are happening is so much more important than just the end result. But yeah. Okay. So, you asked a real quick question of what happened if we put more potassium leak channels. What would happen?
And they depolarize?
Why?
Because there's a bigger chance for it to go in and out, so it's the potential of it.
So,
I'm-
you're saying more positive is leaving the cell than coming back in. Is that what you're saying?
No. Well, it goes both ways. It goes out and in, so I'm not sure.
So the chemical gradient would draw it out, but the electric gradient would pull it back in.
Because the potential would make it more positive, wouldn't it?
So, good thought process. Because that is where your mind probably should go if you're trying to think through all the aspects. However,
But.
so with potassium, the chemical gradient has a stronger impact than the electrical gradient. When there's more opportunity for the potassium to leave the cell, as the overall outcome, more will leave the cell,
To
then comes back in.
hyperpolarize.
So it does hyperpolarize a little bit.
Let's go with the part.
Okay, so
more
if you
would
had
leave- oh,
less,
because more would want to.
so think of it just as the concentration gradient is being the higher card than the electrical gradient.
So,
Okay.
So if you had this many starting with, at your RMP, and then I somehow magically was able to extract them, so you only had one, what would that do? So you have less potassium leak channels.
would depolarize.
Depolarize why?
Because there's less opportunities for it to go in and out, or for
So
the
where is it gonna
potassium
stay more?
inside.
Inside, so more positive inside, depolarize.
Okay.
And that's for the chemical gradient, right? Or
Yeah, that's the because the chemical gradient is a higher card, if you will.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So when it means less positive ions are inside the cell, is that no?
no, you're correct. When it leaves, there are less positive.
So that hyperpolarize is very no.
So if I put in more leak channels,
Mm-hmm.
more would leave, resulting in a
Yeah.
hyperpolarization, correct?
Okay,
Okay, you all right on that?
I think so.
It's just that the concentration gradient trumps it just a little bit, so.
How I think of it is like, you know how like at Jamba Juice they have free smoothie days or whatever, and so it's like that, but if there's only one cashier, you're not gonna want to wait in line for forever, so you probably won't go. But if there's a whole bunch of different cashiers or there's a whole bunch of free smoothies, more people will go get free smoothies. That's like if there's more leak channels open, more potassium's gonna leave because there's less of a wait. You know what I mean?
I get that part, it's
the coming back that gets me.
Oh.
I'm gonna say
No,
that.
you're totally fine.
Because I remember him talking about it in class, how
So-
they'll leave, but because
then
they'll
they come
leave.
back in.
Yeah, and that's where
So,
I'm confused.
The thing is that, so when the charge is changing, you're not really changing the whole charge of the cell,
Okay.
okay? You're changing the charge in this area right here, okay?
Oh.
And so the overall charge doesn't change that much.
Okay.
So when there's more opportunity for it to leave, it will leave because the charge isn't being changed
Mm-hmm.
as much or to the same extent as the concentration gradient. Okay? That's why the concentration gradient's more of a trump. I know. And sometimes you'll hit a moment where it's you have to accept it, and as your mind mulls over it, it'll.
I've got it before and then I lost it.
Okay.
So can you explain what causes it to go back in?
Yes, that would be.
What causes potassium to go back into the cell?
Okay.
The sodium, potassium,
Because I've got it leaving fine. It's
but then, yeah, so why would, or how does potassium go back into the cell? Can you just kind of explain that?
Okay. So there are two ways potassium can get back into the cell when it leaves.
okay.
The biggest one is going to be the sodium-potassium pump.
Okay.
This has an effect, meaning the concentration pushes out, then the electrochemical gradient, so the electric gradient,
Which is
pulling back in as the charge changes, right?
Yeah.
That's going to be in more extreme cases.
So it's not usually
Okay.
gonna blow back in?
It doesn't have as big of an effect,
Oh, okay.
okay?
But mostly just leaves,
The
for the most.
Unless the electrical charges.
what's going to be pulling it in more than the electrical gradient is going to be this guy.
Is the
When you have extreme changes, like in an action potential in an area, this guy will play more of a role, but this guy is what's pulling it back in more than this guy, okay?
Is the steady.
But you do have to understand that there's a point why all of the potassium's not flowing out.
Okay.
The electrical gradient makes it so it doesn't all flow out. But yeah.
Okay. And then this potassium, the voltage, are they voltage gauges, the potassium
Yeah, the
ones?
potassium's voltage.
Yeah.
So, and that opens more slowly than the sodium.
Okay, you're jumping to in an action potential,
Yeah.
correct. That is correct.
And so when it opens it, that lets potassium back
Into the cell.
into the cell, which hyperpolarizes it.
What time is it? 1:43.
Yeah.